Hey, thanks for stopping by. My name's Thomas, and this is Zarbo Audio Projects. And today we're going to be taking a look at this MP3 board that I recently picked up from AliExpress. I'm always on the lookout for new products to use for radios and boombox type of projects, and not too long ago I noticed this one popping up frequently on the Ali website. Let's just get this out of the way with right off the bat. This thing is tiny. Trust me, it's smaller than you probably think it is. Well, let's go over some of the features, and then we'll hook it up, give it a listen, and we'll see what it can do. For physical media, it has a micro SD slot. It also has a USB-A input, and both of those inputs play MP3s, WMA, WAV files, and a few more file types according to the specs. It has an FM radio with auto scan and store. Keep watching to see how that did. It even has a 3.5mm stereo input jack right on the front panel. Nice. On some of these you have to add that on your own, so it's nice that they included it. But the most impressive feature I think is this. It has a built-in amplifier. I've been looking for something like this that has both the preamp and amp in one chassis, controllable by a single remote control for I don't know how long. They're pretty rare. My gripe with all of these preamp things that they sell on AliExpress and pretty much everywhere else is that they don't have any provision to switch on an amplifier. You can turn on the preamp with the remote from your easy chair, but you've got to turn on the amp separately, which means another switch and potentially getting up from that comfortable chair to turn the thing off when you're done. As far as the power output goes on this, the specs say 40 watts per channel, but you know how that goes. It's probably going to do 10 to 12 clean watts with 4 ohm speakers as a guess. As far as the internals go, here's a close-up of the electrical bits and some shots of the chips. The big one says Chip Star on it, and the smaller one is so tiny and the print is so light that I can't make it out. It's like 4mm square. But I think the larger one is the amplifier chip. It lists the usable voltage as being 7 to 25 volts, but in other places I see 12 volts listed. Which is correct? Keep watching to see what I learned about how much voltage it can actually handle. The seller I purchased this from had several versions, with or without the built-in amplifier, and they offer 2 types of remotes. The small card one that's typical with these types of units, and a full-size one. I paid around $8 US for this shipped. Actually less, since I purchased several of them just in case I blow one up. Spoiler alert. I blow one up. So here's a quick look at my mounting jig here. When I test a new unit, I cut a new panel out of 1/8 inch HDF and I mount them in this chassis here. On the back I have easy binding post connectors for DC power with these wire nuts to cover the connection point. I have a built-in telescoping antenna if the unit has an FM radio. That's this blue lead here. I have a 3.5mm input jack for units that have a plug on the back for it but no front mounted jack. Although this one does, as I mentioned. And here we have the speaker outputs left and right if the device has a built-in amplifier. So that's my test jig, and let me show you real quick how this unit works. Upon startup, it reverts to the last input method used. If that's not there, it seems to want to begin looking for a Bluetooth signal. Press the mode button on the unit or the remote control to change inputs. It cycles through Bluetooth, FM radio, auxiliary, and micro SD card, and then the USB input. If there are no SD card or USB flash drive inserted into it, it just skips those options. In order to do an automatic station search and store, you just press and hold this play-pause button. Hold it for a few seconds until it starts. In order to go to the next stored station, you just either short press the back or forward button. Now I don't know how many stations it can store in memory. My unit stored 7 stations, but I'm not sure if it only had space for 7 or if there were only 7 stations that it could pick up. The documentation doesn't say. Okay, let me tell you what I think about this unit. I usually try and start with the good stuff, but I'm going to jump right to the cons. First of all, it's a little noisy. While music is playing either in Bluetooth, SD, or USB modes, there's what I'm going to call a treble noise of some type. It kind of warbles with the music. It sounds a little bit like an FM station that's not quite coming in all the way, if you know what I mean. Next issue. This unit has several EQ settings. Normal is the default. Now you would think that having EQ presets would be a pro, but no, not in this case. Press the EQ button to advance to pop, rock, jazz, classical, cut, and then back to normal, which is where you should leave it. The other settings are awful, and that's all I have to say about that. The next issue is the FM radio. It kind of doesn't really work. You can directly enter the FM stations on the remote so you can get it dialed in correctly. For instance, press 995 for 99.5 WJBR, which is a strong station where I live. But even that one didn't really come in. Rowan Radio WJLS 89.7 is the only station that really came in perfectly. But apparently, they have a transmitter that's only about 1.5 miles from my location. I didn't know that. A few others came in marginally, but the vast majority of stations didn't even come in well enough for me to discern what song was playing. So I think I'm calling the radio a bust on this one. There is another issue with this unit. When you turn up the volume pretty loud, it just sort of cuts off on the heavier bass notes. It just goes quiet for a split second. Then it would come back. That's not the first time I've had this happen with a cheap little amp like this, but in the past it was usually due to a lack of amperage being delivered to the amp. I don't know if that was the case here, but take a look at the size of the wire they included with this unit. That's pretty small. It's got to be 22 or 24 gauge wire. It's really kind of tiny. I'm not sure if that could actually limit the amperage enough to cause the amp to cut out like this, but at loud volumes it did cut out on the bass notes, so I have to call it like I see it. By the way, for most of the time I ran this on my old 13.8 volt 3 amp pyramid power supply. I found that it ran with as little as 5 volts or so, but something happened when I rolled up the juice to 24 volts and turned it up to a fairly loud level. When I juiced it up to 24 volts and cranked it up, it cut off. It didn't come back on once I reduced the voltage. So I disconnected the power supply, lowered the voltage back to 12 volts, and when I turned the unit on again, all I had was a nasty hum from one of the speakers. Yep, it looks like I killed it. That's why I always buy a few of these things when I can. Cheap electronics like this are not usually very durable, if you know what I mean, and they rarely come with any protection circuits included. So I would ignore the 25 volt rating on the product page and just feed it 12 to 14 volts or so. Pretty much what you'd find in an automotive situation. Unless you like smelling burnt electronics. Actually, this thing smelled pretty awful before I fried it. The remote especially. I had to wash my hands to get the smell off after touching it. Anyway, I hooked up another unit and I redid all of my tests, and yeah, it had the same noise issues that the first one had, and it had just as hard of a time pulling in FM stations. Just for reference, I've used other small preamp boards, and most have done a respectable job in finding and locking in on FM stations, so it's not me, it's you. I'm sorry. The next issue is very minor, but the dancing VU meters, they're not connected to the music. I don't hear any music, do you? The last con is this. When you apply power to it, it just turns on. In other words, you don't have to actually press the power button. When you connect voltage, it just turns on its own. I found that almost all of these smaller MP3 player faceplates do the same thing. And that's particularly bad for this unit though, because of what if the power goes out? When it comes back on, since this has a built-in amp, this thing's going to turn on automatically, possibly playing loud music. Imagine having a power outage in the middle of the night and then the power comes back on at 2 a.m. and bam! All of a sudden you got music starting to play from your radio. That's not how I want to wake up. By the way, there is no power button on the unit itself. You've got to use the remote control to actually turn it off. I find that weird for a unit such as this, which is obviously meant to be used in a small, next-to-you type of situation where you might not even have the remote with you. So if you battery power this thing, don't lose that remote. Well, now that I've pretty much lambasted this tiny tune driller, let's focus on the pros and the stuff that I did like about this unit. First of all, like I showed you before, it's tiny. Here are the dimensions. Getting all of those features in such a small space means that you can put this thing in nearly any tiny little box you can think of. Secondly, it has a lot of features for the price, including a nice remote control, Bluetooth 5.0, and folder switching, which I find important because I like to use USB drives to play music from. To go up one folder, you press the volume up button twice quickly, And to go to the previous folder, you press the volume down button twice quickly.
File 1, track 1. File 1, track 1. File 1, file 3, track 1.
Sadly, this only works with the unit and not on the remote. Third, it actually has some oomph to it. I powered my studio set of Neo Nanos plenty loud before it cut out. And while it didn't sound great, it probably sounds almost good enough for what it is. Well, maybe on the low side of good enough. Other cool pluses: it counts up the minutes and seconds while playing songs from the SD card or the USB stick. The remote control works from over 20 feet away indoors, although I found that anything brighter than normal room light could cause it to not see the IR signal. Also, the front display shows the input method while playing, which is nice. And lastly, it does kind of look pretty nice actually. Aside from the fake VU meters, it's pretty understated, which is just my speed. I'm not sure why they went with the old school bright red display instead of the more common LCD screen with a backlight, but I have to say that it is visible from any angle, unlike most of the LCD screens, and it doesn't draw a lot of current, so I guess it's okay. So what kind of project would you use this in? I'd probably stay away from setups with a dedicated tweeter, as the high frequency noise may get tiresome after a while. I mentioned that it cut out louder volumes, and I didn't like that, but truthfully, this happened at a louder volume than I ever imagined someone will want to listen to this thing at. It probably would not be an issue for what it will likely be used for. So, can I recommend this all-in-one Bluetooth media player amplifier? I hate to give unfavorable reviews, but this one's kind of a bust. And the main reason for that is that it's just too noisy. Plus, it blew up when I tried to give it its advertised voltage, so that's not great. But really, the noise is the main issue that I have with this. So if you're thinking this might just be the ticket for your next small audio project, I hate to burst both of our bubbles, but I think it's a good idea to probably steer away from this one. I had high hopes for it too. There are not many Bluetooth preamp boards that have a built-in amplifier that work with one remote control. But despite all of its cool features, this one just doesn't have the sound quality that I need in a portable music player. And that's really all there is to it. I don't know what I expected for $8 shipped, but if it just wasn't so noisy, I'd be okay with it. I'd recommend it, but because of the higher frequency noise, and that's over several units that I tried, I'm just going to have to give this one a pass. Well, that's it for this one. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.